Laine. I'm the president of Liftport Group. We're the folks working on a lunar space elevator infrastructure. By way of background, we started out at the conclusion of the NASA Institute for Advanced Concepts Research project on the Earth space elevator back in 2001, 2, and 3. In 2003, we started Liftport. During those early days, we did robotics, nanotechnology, and materials experiments. We did not make a super strong string. We did make some pretty cool other stuff. We built robots that could climb up and down tethers that were tethered to the ground from as high as a mile and for as long as 60 days. Two different experiments. That first version of the company went out of business in 2007 as a result of the financial crisis. Fast forward, we ran a somewhat successful Kickstarter in 2012. Fast forward again, 2018, we officially recreated the company, focused on the lunar elevator, and we've been focused on the lunar elevator since then. During the pandemic, we almost went out of business, and the pivot that we made was to work on media stuff. So we hosted 27 online virtual conferences. Most of that is available on our YouTube channel. That was great. That was terrific. And then as the pandemic shifted again, we had a lot of assets tied up in our media part of our company. That brand is Better Futures. Eventually, it'll be its own separate company, its own separate spinoff. And then about October last year, we took all of our media assets and we wrapped it up under the Better Futures brand. And we created this DareGreatly space podcast. So definitely take a look at our YouTube channel, take a look at our Spotify channel. Make sure you type DareGreatly space when you're looking for the Spotify channel. And what do we do in the last several months, almost a year, 9 months? We've been focusing on the commercialization of space. So the area that we pay attention to are finance and capital and the money of space. We pay attention to policy, both international and national policy. We look at Space Force and NASA in particular. And we work on infrastructure. Who is building what? And with all that in mind, we've had some really remarkable guests. Last week we had the CEO of a new company, SpaceBuilt. That's 3-star General, Lieutenant General Stephen Quast is starting a new company partnered with the folks from the original Sky Corps, so Dennis Wingo and Bruce Pittman. That's a pretty remarkable story. I definitely want you to take a look at that from last week's episode. We've had the Deputy Administrator of NASA on our program, Lori Garver. We've had the Chief Historian of NASA, Dr. Roger Lanius. We've had the nominated Chief Financial Officer of NASA, Dr. Greg Autry. We've had the son of Buzz Aldrin, Dr. Andy Aldrin. He's a space badass in his own right. He's often overshadowed by his father, but as the professor who created some of the core programs at Embry-Riddle University, he definitely has his own street cred. And in fact, he's going to be joining us again next week as one of our guests. So we've been really fortunate to get some of the top luminaries in the space sector to join our show. We host a program for the Space Frontier Foundation called the Pioneers Series. That will start airing for everybody probably starting next week. Fingers crossed, it might be the week after that. We host Red Planet Live for the Mars Society. So they've been running, I think, 6 months worth of programming. And next month they've got Emily Calandrelli as their guest. So that's going to be a really fun show. We've had Emily on a prior iteration of this show, Conversations for the Future. So she's been a guest with us before. It's been really a lot of fun, and I can kind of see, there's a little bit of a trajectory. Things are starting to grow a little bit. We're starting to get our systems and our processes in place. And I couldn't do any of this without our team. So Leah, who handles kind of operations and logistics, Sinki, who is doing a lot of our necessary video editing. Rachel's been terrific, reporting on original stories on our blog and our new newsletter that's coming out. So hats off to those folks. This stuff couldn't happen without them. And with that preamble, I want to get into what we're talking about today. Now, as a lot of you know, we regularly have guests. We have guests about half the time, maybe a little bit more than that. And then the rest of it is us, whether we're doing news and updates or whether we're doing document reviews, policy reviews. So we're going to do document and policy reviews today. And there's some pretty interesting stuff that came out of Deloitte, and also some stuff that came out of Tesla and SpaceX. We're going to look at both of those things. Before I get into that, I want to kind of acknowledge that there's kind of a crisis on the other side of the country, on the other side of the world for me, that has some implications to the space community. So I'm sure most of you know that a submarine has been lost at sea. They heard clanking this morning, so that is an indication that there might be somebody still alive, but they don't know where that is. So they're definitely running out of time, and they're definitely running out of air. So definitely strong concerns for those folks trapped under the ocean. Honestly, that would be terrifying to me. Curiously, I had a personal interest because the very first career I was ever interested in was oceanography, and especially being in submersibles. So I remember that as something I would aspire to as a kid. I bring it up because there's a lot of crossovers to the space community. So first I'm going to post this article from Alan Boyle. Alan Boyle has been reporting on the space industry for a generation. He and the other person I'm about to mention are arguably, this is Alan here, and this is inside the OceanGate submersible. He did this a couple of years ago, and you can read the article. He did it 4 years ago. But this is Alan in the Puget Sound. Now, Liftport is on the outskirts of Seattle in Tacoma, and Alan went down in this submersible, or a different one, same company, about 4 years ago. So it's a pretty interesting article. You can kind of see his experience, his personal experience. I think he was down for just a few hours or so. So take a look at that. I think it's pretty interesting. Alan is a born explorer in that, but he's always been on the edges. He's always been on the edges of other people's adventures. So it was pretty neat for him to be able to go and do this himself. And then there's this one. Leonard David, also a longtime supporter of I would argue that he's probably the most prolific space reporter in the industry. He has been doing it I've known him for almost 25 years. He writes a personal blog here, and he talks about some of the folks and some of the connections with the space industry. And then my own knowledge is I back in about 2008, I think, maybe it was 2007, when I was having really bad days because my own company was closed. Guillermo Solname offered me a job on a different project. Guillermo is the original CEO of Ocean Gate. He's not been there for many years, almost eight or 9 years. But Guillermo is a financier and an adventurer in the space sector as well. And so all of this stuff comes together under the heading of environmental controls and life support systems. So there's a lot of spacers that do these kinds of experiments, adventures, call it what you want. The idea of going down to the Titanic does not inspire me, but I can appreciate how it inspires other people. So, concern for this, and there's probably going to be ripple effects. I know that two of the people that are down there are supportive of the SETI Institute as well. So a lot of people paying attention to this. Hopefully there's some good news soon. Hopefully the pinging, the knocking helps people find it. Okay. We're switching gears quickly to this. Hats off to Leah for sending this one to me, because I had not seen this one. Why is that not there? Apparently I can't get rid of the ads. So this is a look at Tesla and SpaceX and how the founders, let me rephrase that. The employees of these companies did well enough and got kind of the right place at the right time to go and start their own companies. So these alumni founder maps are actually quite common in the Silicon Valley area. You can find a lot of them. They sometimes refer to them as like the PayPal Mafia or the Amazon Mafia here locally in Seattle. The Microsoft Millionaire Group. There's the Facebook Mafia. You can think that any super large organization that's spun out a lot of decamillionaires, centimillionaires, and billionaires, that kind of wealth concentration. These folks suddenly have available cash, but they're not at retirement age, so they get involved with creating new companies, sometimes related and sometimes very unrelated to their original wealth creating career. So there's a couple things to kind of point out here on the big scale. If you were an employee of Tesla and you left it to go build something, 61 companies and nearly $15 billion in value have been created. If you were an employee of SpaceX and left to go build something else, 93 companies have been created, generating $4 billion of value. So not bad. This report is really worth. It's not a report. It's an image map you can scroll into. I'm going to scroll in just for a moment, and you can kind of navigate. I care less about the Tesla side. I think it's interesting, but it's not key to me. I do wonder what this lunar energy was. I haven't looked that one up yet. So there's a few things on the Tesla side that are interesting. Remember, my first introduction into the space sector was through energy. So I'm always kind of paying attention to that. So there's a bunch of stuff here. And then even more, looking at this list again, 93 companies, $4 billion, 61 companies, $14 billion. I would argue that that's because the valuations will probably go up over time, but since this tends to be focused on hardware, it's a longer path to get built. But you'll recognize some of these companies. I certainly do. Parallel, Talon, Relativity, Varda, Ethos, Apex, Astrolab, Astroforge. We're going to talk about Astroforge here again in a moment. Think Orbital, Vast. That's a pretty good list of folks that are coming out of working at the biggest space company in well, it's not the biggest. Let me rephrase that. The highest cadence space company in the world. Maybe you learn some lessons there, and then you apply those lessons somewhere else. So, yeah, pretty remarkable. This graphic is really worth digging into. There is a lot of information on this graphic. I am just touching the surface of it. Also interesting, how many venture companies are funded through these organizations, right? That one I had not considered before, but I think it's probably pretty interesting. And candidly, I'm probably going to look into these companies a little bit more. I'm very aware of Embedded. I'm very aware of Founders. I don't know these three at all. I think that's very interesting. Embedded is one of the companies we hope to get capital from at some point. So anyway, pretty interesting stuff. I do recommend taking a look at this graphic. I'm going to switch gears here. Thank you, Leah. Appreciate that. Okay, and so let's kind of focus on kind of the core of today's segment. Let me cue it up here. So we're going to look at another report. I think you probably all know Deloitte as a company. They've been around for a really long time. As a management consulting company, right? So that's their bread and butter, is to examine what is going on in the company and then try to improve or strengthen it. And I'm going to give credit where it's due. They cover a lot of industries, right? Can you see all that? Automotive, consumer products, wholesale, retail, transportation, hospitality, defense, security, health, civil, state and local governments, energy, construction, renewables, chemicals, mining, all of these things that they do. And the new thing is space, right? So they're adding a whole new sector that they have not been investigating before. So I think that's kind of a big deal. The report is here. Let me post that. So it's a pretty interesting report. We're going to dig into it in a moment. Before we do, they created a propaganda video. It's interesting. Leah and I talked about it beforehand. We're going to go ahead and run it. But we've got some comments for it. So a limitation of the technology, my microphone will be muted. It's going to play its soundtrack and audio track. There are plenty of places I would like to stop this and have some commentary, but it's a limitation of the video player. I can either speak over it or stop it in the middle and restart it. So you're going to get it in its raw glory. However, I have some comments afterwards. So let's go ahead and get that going here.
Space, the final frontier. Have you ever looked up at the night sky with curiosity, wondering what's out there? Here's an answer that might surprise you. Business opportunities. Space has never been more accessible or rife with potential. Rockets and spaceports on Earth are increasing access to space, to a flourishing ecosystem of satellites, space stations, and services in Earth's nearby orbits and beyond, to the exploration of the Moon, Mars, and deep space. More and more companies, both inside and outside the space industry, are realizing the possibility of breakthrough discoveries and profits. From agriculture companies using satellites to optimize crop yields, to pharmaceutical companies using microgravity to develop life-saving medicines. With over $250 billion invested in the past decade, and likely trillions to come in the next, the growth in space is poised to be exponential, even if it feels early today. We are at the dawn of a new era, where exploration gives rise to economics, and possibility turns the corner toward profitability. Embrace these opportunities today, and the next time you look up at the night sky, you'll be seeing yourself in space.
Okay. So lots of comments there. First of all, whoever crafted this video probably should not have used the now retired for more than 10 years space shuttle as your descriptor of how cool space is. Like that was bad branding. That was a bad design choice. I love the space shuttle, absolutely do. I've made my pilgrimage, my Mecca trip to Kennedy Space Center. I love that thing, but it's been retired. Was it 2008 when they started dividing up the fleet and started handing the fleet to various museums? So it's been offline for nearly 15 years. I don't know what the actual date was, but it's in that range. Maybe it was 2009, but it was a while ago. All right, 2011. Thank you very much, Leah. So 2011, when they started carving up the fleet and handing out the pieces to other people. So the decision to shut down was a lot earlier than that. So it's cool. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful system, but it's definitely an antique. And so to talk about the future by showing an antique was poor judgment. That said, I felt like a lot of the hype in the video is founded on reality. It's founded on truth. So, we've talked many times about how much money is going into the system. As they describe it, $250 million has gone into the space industry as companies, as building out infrastructure. We've only just barely scratched the surface and gotten some ROI off of that. However, even still, last year alone was $464 billion in revenues. And most of that $460 billion is not coming from the new systems that are being constructed. Most of those are not operational yet. So that $250 billion has barely gotten an ROI yet. That $264 billion in revenues is mostly satellites, and many of those satellites have been in place for a long time. Interesting side note, Starlink launched for the very first time in just 4 years ago, 2019, and they currently have just about half of all functional satellites. So you can ramp up pretty fast, and certainly that's a factor in both the $250 billion investment and also the $464 billion in revenues. But that's not the only story, right? And so it is wise for Deloitte to start looking at the future and start trying to understand that. And I would say that this report is a good first draft. They needed to put something out. You've got Bryce and Euroconsult and BIS and my favorite, Space Capital. Like, there are many technical reports about the industry coming online now. And so Deloitte had to do something just to stay relevant and competitive. But I would say this is a strong rough draft. I would not say that they have kind of jumped out of the gate quickly. I think they have got some really good stuff. I really like their graphics and their imagery. But whereas some of those other reports and some of those other documents I was referring to, they have hard numbers with real calculations and real statistics. There's a lot in this document that is, it's forward-looking for sure, which is kind of the point of it, but it is, it's reporting from very knowledgeable experts, but there's very little in terms of statistics and knowledge in this thing. I do like some of this stuff, right? Y Combinator, the largest accelerator in the world. Thousands of companies have started under the Y Combinator system. And I like this quote because I think it's very accurate. When you're dealing with exponential growth, the time to act is when it feels too early. Just hold that a second, let it sink in for a second. The time to act is when it feels too early. And so the area, if anybody knows me in my history, I was too early in the energy. I was too early in the internet and online shopping. I was too early in the Earth elevator, and some would argue I was too early to focus on the moon. So I have been there many times when you can look at the potential of something and know this is where the future is. So I really like that, and I think it's pretty accurate. Deloitte has a document called Tech Trends. I'm going to recommend it. It's pretty interesting. I'm going to post that in the chat. Tech Trends is kind of Deloitte's response to Harvard Business Review, right? They're trying to showcase what's coming from their perspective. So that is right here. It's pretty interesting. It's kind of an online magazine. There's a lot of stuff into it. Pretty worth spending some time on. Why space? Why now? Okay, I'm just going to read it directly. Space beckons. Again, right? Remember, this is solidly a propaganda document. This is a document that is designed for people not in the space industry, but if you have a fleet of cars and you want to understand, or trucks, transportation across the country, you want to understand what's happening with your fleet. maybe space is the place that you want to get that data from. That's what this document is about. It is for people. It is for people that are just getting their first taste of space and the first taste of commercialization. So, if you know it's a propaganda document from the beginning, it's pretty clear to understand it, okay? But that doesn't mean it's wrong. They just have a really strong bias, okay? So I'm going to read their first real paragraph in this document. Why space, why now? Space beckons. From our species' earliest days, a desire to explore beyond the boundaries of our known world has driven human expansion. Why else would we have set sail in canoes without a known destination through the mighty Pacific on our way to settle the islands of Oceania? There is a distinctly human quality that pulls at our hearts as we consider unknown frontiers, quietly convincing us that they, too, must be explored. So I love the writing of this. I love the writing of this document. It is filled with passion and enthusiasm and all the things that drive me for getting into the space sector 20 years ago. So I like how they do this, and I think they do a really good job when they try to build something. I'm going to continue reading. Those earliest sea explorers looked to the stars to guide them on their journeys, but the sea and stars are connected in more ways than this. The driving motivations that led prior humans to explore the sea are remarkably similar to those of today's space pioneers. From creating new sources of wealth and economic opportunity to deepening our understanding of our world and universe. Enabled by advancements in technology and fueled by government and commercial cooperation, the ages of sea and space exploration has shaped and will continue to shape the trajectory of humanity. Pretty hard to argue that. I mean, I'm on the inside of this. My team is on the inside of this, and this is what we believe. This is the ethos that causes us to do what we're doing. I'm not going to read the whole thing. There's definitely some cool stuff in here. They talk about the report and the language and the people. I'm going to post a different link here, just a moment. And this is their, I'll call it their sales pitch. Why is this not happening here? Nothing is happening on my side. Okay, well, their sales pitch does not seem to be working. All right, we're going to skip that. It's Deloitte Space. Just Google that. This is one of the things I want you to look at. All right, so I said that this document was really empty when it comes to statistics and math to support their positions. But these people, these industry experts, definitely deserve your attention and respect. I personally know several people on this list. I have a lot of respect for the ones that I don't know. Greg Autry has been a guest on our show maybe 6 or 7 times, depending on which iteration, which program you're talking about. He was the nominated but not confirmed Chief Financial Officer of NASA. He is the director of the Thunderbird School of Space Management. So pretty remarkable guy. I've known him for about 7 years, 8 years, something like that. Tori Bruno, been the CEO of ULA for, 12 years, something like that. Sarah Crudis has been reporting on the industry for about 6 or 7 years. Roger Lonius, I just mentioned, he's been on our show twice. Fascinating interview, by the way. I want to point that out. We've got Greg Autry. We're scheduling him, we think, in July. And we've had Roger Lanius on the show twice, going back, I think, to December last year, one of our earliest guests. Rod Pyle has been writing on the space sector for about 8 or 12 years. Most notably editor-in-chief at Ad Astra, but also a solid science fiction author in his own right. Both Scott Rodriguez and Mike Lewis at NanoRacks, they have arguably one of the strongest space station development organizations in the world. So just a really terrific cast of experts that I don't know how much time they invested into this report, but these are very knowledgeable people. So I like the crew that they brought on board. Hang on a second. I like this piece. I like how they're dividing it of here, near, and there. I think that actually is a pretty smart way of approaching it, right? Here, meaning down here on the ground, the space economy's historic barriers to entry are being decreased, de-risked, and democratized. Near, very near, in Earth's orbit, entrepreneurs and enterprises alike are turning possibility into profitability. And there, out there, in deep space, a new frontier for human health, wealth, and wisdom awaits. Again, I like the writing of this document, but I also like how they conceptualized it. What's down here on the ground, what's close and available now that's being worked on, and what's out there a little bit further. And if you remember any of the other shows when we were showing, especially Space Capital, they break these sections down into dollars and cents and how much has been invested and how much is returning revenue. In a somewhat similar perspective, they break it into a lot more parts, like 7 or 8 parts, 6 or 7 parts. But I like the here, near, and there. I like the graphics everywhere, right? This piece spans all of these regions. As you know, I'm a big fan of building stuff in low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit, but really where Liftport is focused is out further. So we always are in the kind of the outside outliers section. If it were me, I would have made the graphic of the moon a lot bigger and the graphic of Mars a lot smaller. 1 for distance and 2 for probability. So that's a little tidbit I would have done differently. But what are we talking about, right? We know that there are half a dozen space station companies that are well-funded, well-staffed, and building, viable hardware. So that's a big deal. We talked to Lieutenant General Quast Monday about off-world production, right? That is a thing. It's not here right now, but it's going to be here soon. It's close. It's a lot closer than people anticipate. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit. They have a lot of interest in rocketry, right? In 2015, SpaceX demonstrated the ability to successfully land a rocket back on Earth intact for use in future launches. By the way, that was astounding for anybody who ever watched that. That was a game changer for sure. And that is kind of the basis for what they think is coming next, right? As costs decrease, the launch business model is also evolving. Rideshare missions in which multiple payloads from different customers are hosted on a single launch vehicle can help businesses get payloads to orbit in a more cost-efficient, timely, and sustainable manner. I posted an article to Discord earlier today talking about the potential and the pitfalls of Starshield, the government-focused system that SpaceX is building. So I recommend you go take a look at that one. Leah, if you could find a link to that, that would be helpful. But it's real, right? There's a lot of stuff happening really quickly right now. And it's not just about SpaceX, right? They're the ones who get all the attention because they've got really good marketing. And they're the ones who get a lot of attention because they're really good at their job. And they're the ones who get a lot of attention because they have a crazy cadence of launch capabilities and recovery. They just recovered their 200th system. Like, that's remarkable. They deserve a lot of credit, but that's not the only game in town. That's not the only company trying to do this. Now, I like this graphic at the bottom. I think this graphic is really worth reading. I'm not gonna do that for you. I probably wouldn't have argued the first. I probably would not have put 1926 on this list. That's when Goddard launched his first system. Okay, it was cool, and actually I was surprised that I didn't know that already, but I think maybe we should have a celebration in 2026, just 3 years from now, to recognize that accomplishment. I always think the space age starts in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik. That's where I draw the mark. But this is a pretty good graphic, and it's got a really nice history of the world's space development. I think it's well done, and it continues on down here. So worth taking a look. I would not have put Relativity Space's 3D printed rocket in the bar next to SpaceX's Starship. Everybody here knows I'm a big fan of the Starship Singularity and what's going to happen when that thing goes. But Blue, and I would have probably put Virgin and the Google Lunar X Prize on this list. So there's some things I wouldn't have put on, and there's some things I would have put on. But in general, I think this is a pretty cool history of space development. They talk a lot about the innovation of this industry, and this graphic at the bottom really shows it, right? So they've got one graphic that's just covering the last 20 years, and then they've got one graphic that's covering 70 years. So that's an indication that things are changing. And not everything made this list, right? That's really important to note. So I would have done some of this differently. They're focusing on in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. That's really important. This stuff is enabling that stuff. So this rocketry innovation enables the next set of innovations. This is worth reading. Gateways to the Galaxy. Spaceport development is critical for meeting launch demand. Pardon me a second. Wow, excuse me. Sorry about that. Don't know where that came from. It's kind of awkward sneezing on camera. I hope that gets edited out. So the developments in spaceports is really necessary, and it's actually lagging. It's actually behind where we need. Spaceports in Florida are full and overflowing. Spaceports in Texas, meaning SpaceX and Blue, are full and overflowing. Spaceports in California are full and overflowing. There's not enough real estate to launch from. And that's a really big problem. There have been attempts to build new spaceports in Georgia. They spent a lot of money on that, and it went nowhere, and it was voted down. There's a big "not in my backyard" movement when a spaceport is proposed. Here in Washington State, there's been talk for a long time, but it's never been acted on, to create a spaceport out of the Everett area, where Boeing already has an experimental airport, and to turn that into a spaceport. It's half an hour outside of Seattle. It's easy to get to. You could conceivably take a helicopter from downtown Seattle over to the spaceport, from the spaceport to Tokyo. Maybe that whole trip is 45 minutes or an hour. So, but that technology doesn't exist yet, and the infrastructure isn't there. And as we saw pretty dramatically, the spaceport components determine whether or not Starship can launch again on time. So they underestimated the spaceport component of that super spaceship. So that's not going to be the last time. That's the first time. There's been talk about building ocean-based spaceports. Tom Murata, former intern here at Liftport, is now the CEO of the spaceport company. So it's interesting, and that is a problem. It's a problem that we have not resolved. What's fascinating is the United Kingdom has more spaceports in development than the United States does. And that is kind of bonkers to me. That is really surprising. And there's one announced in Africa. There's one spaceport in a country in a continent with 54 countries. There's one spaceport, and it's not even under construction yet. So remarkable. That is bonkers to me, that the second most populous continent in the world doesn't have a spaceport. So, that is definitely a divider between the haves and have-not nations. And I think that's going to be a big problem soon. So spaceports, gotta put some energy, gotta put some cash behind developing spaceports, because the technology is currently outpacing the infrastructure necessary to use it. That was also the case, by the way, with the early days of the internet, that the computing power was faster than the data broadcast power. And so these are throttles on the industry, and if we don't get ahead of it, it's going to be a problem. Final thoughts. An increase in payload capacity, launch frequency, and spaceport capabilities is opening up access to Earth's orbits and beyond. And the space industry's shifting business model for reaching space is further enabling this transformation. In the same way, the computer processing and storage has moved from on-premise to the cloud, launch capabilities are transitioning to an as-a-service model. Space launch is no longer a do-it-yourself end-to-end initiative, nor a project to be outsourced to a single contractor. Instead, the as-a-service business model is transforming space launch in the same way that cloud democratized IT, making it increasingly accessible, responsive, and affordable. So that's the world that we're going into right now, and I think that's you got to pay attention to this stuff. Okay, we only have a few more minutes. So I'm going to kind of race through a few pieces here. orbit, right? That's the new cool, right? You've heard me talk about a lot about orbits. Every time I talk about them, I say, go out, look at the night sky, because every 2 days, every 3 days, somewhere in the world, someone is launching another satellite. And the sky tonight will not be the same 2 nights from now or 3 nights from now. You've heard me say this before. When I started in this industry, there were 400 satellites. SpaceX alone owns almost 4,000. They launch more than that for their customers. So there's about 8,000 satellites in the sky now. Soon there are mega constellations. Some of them are 100,000 satellites. Some of them are 30,000 satellites. There's a proposal, I don't think it's yet funded, for a 300,000 satellite constellation. China is very worried about how much dominance the United States in particular has in orbital positioning, or orbital slots. And so they're working on all fronts, financial, technological, and legal, to get their own constellation of about 100,000 satellites built. So I know nobody really wants to spend a lot of time talking about orbital slot allocation and the process of that. As an American company, we have to go through the FCC, the FAA. The FAA then is the lead liaison. They have to talk to NASA, NOAA, Department of State, Department of Commerce, and somebody else that I've forgotten. There's five internal. Department of Defense. There's 5 internal organizations, according 5 federal organizations that we have to get approvals for. The FAA is our coordinating body. But then once that happens, we then have to jump to the international level, and the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, has to sign off on orbital slots. This is really complicated stuff. It's very expensive from the perspective of lawyers. And so the idea of having 40,000, 80,000, 400,000 satellites in the sky in the next 20 years, financially, legally, technologically, very, very complicated. When I was a kid, the idea of seeing a satellite was a big deal. Like when I was camping in the backyard or out in the woods somewhere, you'd actually wake up your friends because you're like, hey, there's a satellite. And that was cool. It was exciting in 1984, 1982, because it was rare. And now it's going to be everywhere all the time. There's going to be satellites in the sky everywhere all the time, wherever you are in the world. So these constellations are a pretty big deal. Currently, almost all of the $500 billion in revenue is coming from satellite communications. That's not 100% true, but it's mostly true. And that's going to be consistent going forward, that most of the revenues in space for the foreseeable future most of the profits in space in the foreseeable future is going to come from satellites, beaming data from where it is to where it needs to be. And that really shouldn't surprise anybody. But when you start talking in terms of $500 billion, $500 billion, $464 billion in revenues last year, most of it, 85% of it, came from satellites. And that's going to stay like that for the foreseeable future. There will be a day someday when the space economy is bigger than the Earth economy, but we are a long ways from that. That might be generations from now. Cyber and defense, obviously super important. You know my feelings on U.S. Space Force. Navigation, satellite navigation. It's funny. These reports don't value things like Uber or Amazon or delivery capabilities. They're not calculated in this space revenues reports. In the whole sector completely takes the value of those services out of the system because they are indirect to the space sector. They're indirect revenues, they're not direct revenues. But the world would be pretty dramatically different if you didn't get your Amazon package delivered on time, if you're standing on the corner in the rain waiting for your Lyft driver to pick you up. But those things only happen because of GPS, and they're not calculated in these reports. So when I talk about $500 billion in revenues, the value of space is probably a lot higher than that. Okay. I want to recommend this report. It's definitely worth reading. This futures piece is fascinating. The sectors, we kind of already know this stuff, so I'm kind of not skipping it. I'm skipping it kind of on purpose. The last things I would point out would be this section, the there section. Definitely worth reading and looking at. We might talk about this some more next week or the week after. Because we've got several guests scheduled, we might not be able to get back to it, but we're thinking of that. So the moon, Mars, all that super cool stuff. They specifically break out. I was trying to find it. I thought it was right here. They specifically, here we go, this conclusion. I want to read this. The space economy has reached an inflection point in terms of both access and opportunity. I'm going to skip all that. This is the piece I wanted. But how will we power this party? In a world of energy scarcity, space offers us untapped abundance. From space-based solar power, where satellite arrays collect solar power, convert it to microwaves, and transmit it to Earth-based ground stations that turn it into electricity, to helium-3 extraction for nuclear fusion reactors, the keys to unlocking a clean energy revolution on Earth could very well be hiding in the skies above. Right? That's why I got into this sector in the first place. That one paragraph sums it up, my whole personal mission. So really interesting reading, definitely worth paying attention to. These are some of the people that have been involved. Their backgrounds are fascinating. I don't know most of these people, so that was cool. And these endnotes are definitely worth clicking on the links. This will give you a really detailed perspective of where we are and where we're likely to be going. So I know this is a lot of homework, but it's homework that's worth doing. Okay. And with that, we're going to, space mining is in there. Thank you. That's a great comment. Space mining is definitely a part of that. Metals and mining was a whole section in there. So that's it for today's program. We've got several guests coming up. We've got Andy Aldrin. We've got Melissa Roth. We've got Bailey Burns. Bailey's going to be super fun. All of these are great. Bailey's environmental controls and life support. She has an interesting career. She's a younger woman, which is great because we haven't had a lot of younger women on our show. So that was very intentional. And for that matter, Melissa Roth is a younger female professional as well. So that's going to be terrific. Andy Aldrin's always great. So those are all upcoming. We're trying really hard to schedule a pretty prestigious guest, but we haven't gotten confirmation on that, so I can't share that one with you. And we've got some really cool stuff coming up in the Pioneers series. So join us. We'll be back. Our program's on Mondays and Wednesdays, and then starting pretty soon, regularly on Tuesdays as well. So that's all. Thanks very much, y'all. I appreciate my staff. I appreciate all of our community for being a part of this. See you next Monday. Bye-bye.